When Miriam pulled a wounded Apache into her home, she knew the whispers would come, the danger would follow, the judgment would burn. But what she didn't know was that love would grow in the very place fear had once lived. The sun hung heavy in the sky that day, pressing down on the land until every blade of grass wilted and the creek near Miriam's homestead shrank into a shallow trickle of brown water. The boards of the cabin groaned in the heat, the chickens lay in the dust with wings spread, and Miriam moved slowly through the chores, each step weighted with the loneliness that had settled over her since her family was gone. She bent to fill a pail at the creek, her dress clinging to her back with sweat, her hair plastered against her cheeks. The air was still, so quiet she could hear the buzzing of flies and the slow drip of water from the rocks above. Then a sound broke through the silence. Not sharp, not loud, but the strained gasp of someone fighting for breath. Her heart leapt and she spun, eyes wide, and saw him lying half in the water, half on the bank. His skin was bronze with dust, his long hair tangled, and his chest rose shallowly as blood seeped dark and steady from his side. He wore the leather and beads she had only glimpsed from afar, the kind her father once warned her about, with stories of raids and arrows in the night. Fear rooted her in place, her breath ragged as her mind screamed to run back to the cabin, to bar the door, to pray the men from town never learned he had fallen this close to her land. Yet when his eyes fluttered open and met hers, the world seemed to still. They were not wild with rage or sharpened with hate. They were tired, dark as the soil after rain, and in their depth was something that stilled her trembling hands. She stepped forward before she knew why, knees sinking into the mud at his side, her voice caught in her throat, torn between words she had no practice speaking to someone like him. He groaned, tried to push himself up, but fell back with a hiss of pain. The wound looked deep, the cloth at his waist soaked through. She whispered that she should fetch help, though she knew no one would come without finishing him off. Her hands hovered, uncertain, then pressed against his wound as best she could. His body tensed under her touch, a low growl escaping, but he did not push her away. The creek trickled beside them, carrying away thin strands of blood, and the sun lowered just enough to cool the air. Miriam glanced back at the cabin, her only shelter, and then at the stranger who lay between life and death on her land. She saw the strength still in his frame, the scars across his arms, but she also saw how alone he was. Something within her, some old ache from years of being left behind, told her she could not leave him here to die. With a trembling breath, she pulled his arm over her shoulder, straining beneath his weight, and began dragging him toward the cabin, step by step, her fear heavy, but her resolve heavier. Miriam staggered as she dragged the stranger across the dry ground, his arm heavy over her shoulder, his body sagging with every step, until she thought her knees might give way. The door of the cabin scraped open under her push, and she half carried, half pulled him onto her narrow bed, the boards creaking under the weight of them both. Her breath came fast, her chest aching from fear and effort, as she stood staring at the blood spreading quickly across the sheets. It was more red than she had ever seen at once, thick and hot and real, and it struck her that this man could die in her hands before the night was through. She wanted to run, she wanted to scream, but instead she moved clumsily toward the basin of water, fumbling with the cloths, her hands shaking as she tore them into strips. When she pressed the first cloth against the wound, he jerked his body taut with a hiss of pain, his teeth clenched, his eyes shut as if bracing for an enemy's knife. Miriam whispered that she meant no harm, though she knew he did not understand the words. Still, she held steady, pressing hard against the flow, her own fingers slick and trembling as the blood seeped through. She found her breath slowing, with the rhythm of the work, her fear turning into focus as she cleaned the wound as best she could, rinsing with water that turned pink in the basin. She had seen her mother stitch cloth and mend hides but never skin. Her hands were clumsy, her thread uneven, yet stubbornness drove her on, and she stitched as carefully as her shaking fingers allowed. The room smelled of sweat and iron and smoke from the fire that burned low in the hearth. Hours passed, or maybe only moments, she could not tell, as the light faded through the single window. His breathing was shallow but steady, his chest rising like a bellows fighting for air. Miriam sat beside the bed, her arms sore, her body weary, but her eyes fixed on his face, waiting for him to stir, waiting for some sign that her work had not been in vain. She thought of what the neighbors would say if they saw her, now alone in a cabin with a wounded Apache, their voices sharp with judgment, their eyes filled with scorn. They would call her a traitor, they would call her a fool, and maybe she was both, but she could not bring herself to leave him bleeding in the dirt. When at last his eyes opened, they found hers in the dim light, dark and steady, and she felt her breath catch as he tried to speak. The words came rough and broken, but clear enough. "Thank you," he whispered in heavy accented English, his voice hoarse but certain. Miriam froze, the sound so unexpected that it felt like the ground had shifted beneath her. She swallowed hard and asked his name, her voice soft and unsteady. "Kael," he said with effort, the single word, carrying weight like a stone set upon the table between them. She nodded slowly, repeating it under her breath, "Kael." And in that moment she knew nothing would ever be the same again. The days that followed fell into a strange rhythm that neither of them spoke aloud. The sun rose and set as it always had, yet inside the cabin time felt heavier, slower, marked not by the usual tasks of tending chickens or fetching water, but by the sound of breathing that was not her own. Miriam cooked in silence, her hands busy with bread and stew, while her eyes stole glances toward the bed where Kael lay, resting his side bound in the strips she had tied. He did not speak much, and when he did, it was only a word here or there, his English broken yet steady. She answered with nods and gestures, unsure how much he understood, yet finding comfort in the quiet way he watched her, as though he was trying to read not just her words, but her heart. At first fear clung to her like a shadow. Every time he shifted or sat upright, her stomach tightened. Every time she saw the strength in his arms, she remembered the stories of raids and burning homes. Yet when he tried to rise too soon, determined to stand before his wound had closed, she saw another kind of strength. He swayed, then fell to his knees, the breath knocked from him, his hand clutching at his side. Miriam dropped the ladle she was holding and rushed forward, without thought, slipping her arms beneath his to keep him from hitting the floor. He looked at her then, his face drawn with pain, but his eyes steady, meeting hers in a moment that felt longer than it truly was. She helped him back onto the bed, and in that simple act, something shifted between them. She was no longer just the frightened woman who had taken in a wounded stranger, and he was no longer the feared warrior she had been taught to despise. They were two people, bound by a wound and a silence that carried more weight than words could. In the evenings, she lit a lamp and mended torn cloth, while Kael lay watching the fire, his breathing slower each day, his body growing stronger. Sometimes he would lift a hand and point toward an object, a chair, a bucket, a spoon, and speak the Apache word for it low and firm. Miriam would repeat it awkward on her tongue, and he would nod, once his face unreadable. Other times she would name the same things in English, and his lips would move carefully over the sounds. Their lessons were clumsy, full of pauses and mistakes, yet it became their language of survival, a way to cross the gulf between them without bridges of fear. Outside, the world went on. Riders passed along the distant road, dust rising behind them, and Miriam knew if any stopped and looked inside her cabin, everything would be lost. But in those quiet days, she began to care less for what the world thought. She saw how Kael's patience matched her fear, how he never rushed her, never reached for her with anything but calm. And she realized, with a small jolt of truth, that neither of them was the enemy their worlds had claimed. The nights grew cooler, as autumn pressed against the edges of the land, and the wind carried the smell of dry grass and smoke from distant fires. Miriam sat by the hearth, mending a torn hem, while Kael rested on the bed, his body stronger now, though the wound still slowed him. In the crackle of the fire she sometimes heard her father's voice, as if it lingered in the corners of the cabin. He had told stories of raids with his jaw set tight and his hands clenched white on the table, stories of painted warriors riding in under the cover of night, stories of families torn apart and fields left in ashes. She had listened as a child, with wide eyes and fear curling in her belly, believing every word because he had spoken with such certainty. Now she looked at Kael across the room and saw a man, not the monster of those tales. His skin bore scars that spoke of battles she could not imagine, yet in the way he sat quietly watching the fire, there was no cruelty, only weariness. One evening she caught him rubbing the scar on his arm as if it burned with old memory. She asked without thinking where it had come from, and after a long pause he spoke in broken English, words shaped carefully. "Battle," he said, hand touching the scar again. "Brother die," voice lowering as if the air itself might grow heavy with grief. Miriam's needle stilled between her fingers. She had never thought of them, these men her father called savages, as brothers or sons, but only as shadows that brought destruction. She studied his face and saw the way his jaw tightened when he spoke, how his eyes did not blink, as though holding back something deeper than words could carry. Her heart stirred with a strange ache, for she too carried ghosts. She thought of her mother's gentle hands, gone too soon, of her father buried in the hard ground after fever, of her brothers lost one by one, until she was left with a silence that swallowed the house whole. She did not say all this, but Kael seemed to sense it, his gaze settling on her with a quiet that needed no explanation. He lifted his hand and made a small gesture over his chest, then spoke again. "Pain heavy, carry always." She nodded slowly, the words sinking into her, like seeds into soil. The fire threw long shadows on the walls, and in those shadows Miriam no longer saw raiders with torches or the faces of enemies, but two figures bent beneath the same burden. Grief wrapped around them both, binding them in a way stronger than fear or suspicion. She set her sewing aside and moved to sit near him, not close enough to touch, but close enough to feel the warmth of his presence. He did not look at her, yet she felt the weight in the air ease, as if for the first time the silence was shared rather than endured. That night, before sleep claimed her, she realized the stories her father told had not been lies exactly, but they had been only half of the truth. The other half sat across from her, scarred, quiet, and human. The sky was pale with dust when Miriam heard the first sound of hooves along the road, the steady beat of more than one horse carrying trouble in its rhythm. She was hauling water from the creek when her neighbor's boy came riding fast, his face tight as he shouted that men in town had been talking, that someone claimed an Apache had been seen near the bend where her land met the flats. Miriam felt her stomach twist as if the words themselves were knives, for she knew at once the whispers pointed toward Kael. She thanked the boy with a nod, her throat too dry for words, then hurried back to the cabin, her heart pounding louder than her steps. Kael was sitting near the fire sharpening a small blade, the wound at his side still mending, but strength was returning to his arms. When she told him what she had heard, his eyes narrowed, not in surprise but in weary acceptance, as though he had expected this moment all along. She led him quickly to the barn, the old boards creaking under their weight, as she cleared a space behind the stacked hay. He ducked low, his broad frame almost too large for the narrow corner, and she covered him with a rough blanket, whispering that he must not make a sound. He only gave her one steady look, his dark eyes holding both warning and trust, then lay still. Miriam returned to the porch just as the riders came into sight. 3 men from town with rifles across their saddles, their faces hard with suspicion. They greeted her with forced politeness, but their eyes slid past her shoulder to the cabin and then to the barn. One asked if she had seen anything unusual, if anyone had come by asking for water. She shook her head, willing her voice not to tremble, and said she had seen no one. The men dismounted anyway, their boots thudding against the dirt as they walked past her toward the barn. Miriam's breath caught, her hands tightening on her skirt until her knuckles ached. She wanted to shout at them to leave, But she forced herself to stand calm, to watch as they opened the barn doors and peered inside. The smell of hay and old wood filled the air, and one of the men muttered that the tracks they had been told about were nothing but cattle prints. After a few minutes of searching, they came out empty-handed, grumbling about wasting their time. They mounted their horses again, warning her to be careful, that these lands were not safe with savages roaming. She nodded and watched them ride away, her body stiff until the sound of hooves faded into the distance. When she slipped back into the barn, Kael was already rising from his hiding place, his jaw tight and his eyes full of something she could not name. He spoke low, his English halting but clear enough. "You should send me away," he said, his voice rough with both pride and concern. "Trouble will come again." Miriam shook her head before he finished, her hands trembling but her voice steady as she told him she would not hand over a life she had fought to save. He looked at her a long moment, then gave a slow nod, and in that silence they both understood the choice had already been made. The wind rattled the shutters that night, and the old cabin groaned, as if the boards themselves remembered storms of long ago. Miriam lay restless on the bed, her dreams heavy with the face of her mother, soft and kind, calling her name from a distance she could not cross. She reached for her and felt only emptiness, the ache of years pressing against her chest until she woke with a start, her breath sharp, her cheeks damp with tears she had not meant to shed. For a moment she did not know if she was still dreaming, for the room was lit not by moonlight, but by the flicker of fire, and there was Kael, crouched near the hearth, feeding the flames with a careful hand. His shadow stretched tall against the wall as he added another log, the sparks rising like stars. He looked over his shoulder when he sensed her eyes upon him, his expression calm, not startled or prying, only steady. She sat up slowly, brushing her hair from her face, embarrassed to have been caught in the weakness of dreaming. Yet he did not mock, did not question, only held her gaze with the quiet strength of someone who understood what it was to be haunted. The fire crackled between them, warm against the cold that pressed through the cracks of the cabin, and Kael spoke a word in his tongue, low and steady, pointing at the flames. Miriam frowned, repeating it clumsily, and his lips curved in something near a smile as he corrected her. Again he said, and she tried once more, the sound foreign on her tongue but less awkward the second time. "Fire," she whispered in English, and he nodded, repeating it back with care, his voice rough but sure. He then touched the basin of water by the wall, naming it in Apache, the syllables deep and musical, and again she repeated until he gave another nod of approval. Hour slipped into hour as they traded words, the language of her people and the language of his crossing in the space between them. "Earth," he said, pressing his palm to the floor, and she mirrored the gesture, saying the word in her own tongue. The rhythm of it soothed her, as if by naming the simplest things they were weaving a thread that bound them closer, stronger than fear, stronger than silence. When her voice faltered from weariness, she leaned back against the post of the bed, watching him through the firelight. His face was marked by shadows and scars, yet the way he spoke with patience, never rushing her, made her chest feel lighter than it had in years. She thought of the long evenings after her family was gone, when the cabin had been filled with nothing but her own breathing, when loneliness had settled heavy like a second skin. Now there was another heartbeat in the room, another voice, and though words still failed them often, she felt less like a ghost and more like a woman alive in the world. As the fire warmed her skin and the wind howled outside, Miriam closed her eyes, not with fear but with a fragile peace, knowing for the first time in years she was not alone. The afternoon was hot and heavy, with the kind of silence that pressed on the ears until every sound seemed sharper. Miriam was carrying a basket of feed toward the barn when she heard the sudden dry rattle that froze her blood. She stopped mid-step, her breath caught in her throat, her eyes darting to the ground. Just beyond her boots coiled the thick body of a rattlesnake, its tail shaking with a sound that cut through the still air like the crack of a whip. its head lifted, tongue flicking, eyes fixed on her as if waiting for the smallest move. Miriam stood as if turned to stone, her hands gripping the basket so tightly the weave cut into her palms. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat a hammer striking louder than the rattle that warned her not to move. She thought of the distance to the cabin, of the door she could not reach, of the rifle leaning just out of reach by the porch. She swallowed hard, a tremor racing through her legs, and for a breath she thought this might be the end, that all her stubbornness to survive would finish here in the dust, at the mercy of a coiled serpent. The barn door creaked then, and Kael stepped into the light, still limping from the wound that had not fully healed. His eyes caught the movement before hers could leave the snake, and in an instant his body changed. The calm, patient man, who had sat by her fire, became a warrior again, his hand already reaching for the knife at his belt. He moved with a sharp precision that startled her, each step measured, silent, controlled. The snake's rattle grew louder, its body tense as it struck forward. But Kael's arm cut through the air faster than her eyes could follow. The blade flashed once in the sun, and then the serpent fell silent, its body twisting in the dust before lying still. For a long moment, Miriam could not move. Her breath came in shallow bursts, her legs weak as though the venom had already found her. She looked at Kael, at the knife still in his hand, at the swiftness with which he had killed what had nearly killed her. He turned to her slowly, his face unreadable, his chest rising and falling with the same quiet steadiness he always carried. He bent and kicked the dead snake aside, wiping his blade on the grass before sliding it back into place. Miriam finally let out the breath she had been holding, her hands loosening around the basket until it nearly slipped from her grip. She had always been taught to fear men like him, to see danger in the very shape of their shadows. And yet in that moment she saw that the danger he carried was not turned toward her, but against the things that threatened her life. Her fear did not vanish at once, but it shifted, loosening its grip on her chest and leaving something else behind. She could not yet call it trust, nor could she name the warmth that spread through her at the sight of him standing between her and the snake. But it was real as the silence that followed, when the rattle was no more. The days stretched long and golden as summer began to fade, and Kael grew stronger with each sunrise. He spoke often now of leaving, of returning to his people who would be waiting for him somewhere beyond the hills. Yet when morning came, he did not go. Instead, he followed Miriam to the fences, steadying the posts with his broad hands while she hammered them back into place. His limp slowed him but did not stop him, and she watched with quiet wonder as he worked beside her as if the land was his own. When she went to fetch water, he carried the buckets without being asked, his stride easy despite the weight. Each time she told him he should not push himself, he only gave a small shake of his head and said nothing. Yet she could read the truth in his silence. He lingered because something unseen held him, and she did not dare give it a name. The neighbors began to notice. Riders passed slower along the road, their eyes sliding toward the cabin and the barn, their voices hushed but sharp as they exchanged words she could not hear. At the well in town, she caught the stares of women who once offered her polite greetings, but now turned their backs. She felt their suspicion pressing on her skin like a brand. Yet when she returned home and saw Kael by the fire splitting wood or tending the animals, she felt the weight of their judgment lessen. What they thought mattered less than the quiet she found in his presence. Inside the cabin the silence grew soft, no longer heavy with fear but filled with a strange peace. At dusk she sat by the hearth humming the hymns her mother once sang, low tunes that had comforted her as a child. Kael would listen, his head tilted as though chasing the meaning of the sounds, then try to follow, his deep voice rough but steady. The words were broken on his tongue, yet the melody carried across the space between them until she felt her chest ache with something close to hope. At night he led her outside, pointing toward the sky where the stars shone sharp and endless above the dark hills. His finger traced shapes she had never noticed, animals and warriors and rivers drawn across the heavens. He spoke their names in Apache, the words rolling deep and sure, and she repeated them slowly, her voice trembling not with fear but with wonder. The stars she had always seen as distant lights became alive in his telling, each one part of a story older than any she had ever known. There were moments when the world intruded, when she remembered the whispers and the danger of being seen with him, yet those moments passed like fleeting shadows. What remained was the steady rhythm of their days, the shared work, the simple lessons, the firelight at night, the stars above. Between his people and hers lay a gulf carved deep by years of blood and mistrust. Yet within the walls of her cabin and under the wide sky, they carved a place of their own. She did not yet know if he would stay or go, but for now she needed nothing more than the peace that lingered in the silence they shared. The first light of dawn had barely touched the horizon when Miriam woke to the sound of hooves pounding against the hard earth. At first she thought it was only a passing wagon or riders on the road, but when the noise grew louder and the dogs began to bark, she knew trouble had come to her door. Her heart thudded in her chest as she rose from the bed, her bare feet cold against the floorboards. She pulled on her shawl and stepped toward the window, the pale glow of morning just enough to show the shapes of men on horseback, rifles slung across their shoulders, eyes fixed on the cabin. Her breath caught as she turned to Kael, who was already awake, his body tense, his gaze steady, as if he had been expecting this moment. The knock came hard, more like the butt of a rifle striking wood than any polite request to enter. Miriam's hands trembled as she opened the door a crack, and the sight of her neighbors on horseback filled her with dread. Their faces were hard, their eyes cold, and their voices sharp as they demanded to know where the Apache was. Before she could answer, they pushed past her, their boots striking the floor, their rifles glinting in the dim light. Kael stood near the hearth, his shoulders straight, his expression calm but unyielding. He made no move to fight, only watched as they spread through the room like a flood, their hatred spilling into every corner. One of the men spat on the floor and called Kael a trespasser. Another raised his rifle and sneered that they ought to string him up before he brought others down upon them. Miriam's voice broke as she begged them to stop, her words tumbling out fast and desperate, telling them he was no enemy, that he had done nothing but heal and help. But her pleas fell flat against ears that had long ago closed to reason. Their eyes were filled with the old stories, the ones of raids and fire and blood, and no amount of truth could strip away what they had chosen to believe. When they grabbed Kael by the arms and dragged him toward the door, Miriam felt her body move before her mind caught up. She rushed to the doorway and planted herself against the frame, her arms spread wide, her knees shaking though she stood firm. The men shouted for her to move, their faces twisted with disbelief that she would stand in their way. One called her foolish, another whispered the word traitor, and the weight of it pressed against her chest like a stone. Still she did not move. She looked back at Kael, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on her with a calm that made her heart ache. He gave a small shake of his head, as if to say, "Let it be," but she could not. She turned back to the men and told them again that he was not their enemy, her voice trembling yet loud enough to carry into the pale morning air. For a moment the world held still, the sun edging higher, the rifles pointed steady, the breath of horses clouding in the cool dawn. Then one of the riders cursed and lowered his gun, muttering that this was not over, that she would regret her choice. With a shove they released Kael and mounted their horses, the thunder of hooves fading as quickly as it had come. Miriam stood frozen in the doorway, her breath ragged, the tremor still in her bones, yet her heart fierce with the knowledge that she had chosen her side. The sun had barely climbed above the hills when they came again, harder this time, their voices rough with anger, and their rifles drawn before they even dismounted. Miriam had barely stepped outside when they pushed past her, dragging Kael into the yard, his hands bound behind him, his face bruised from blows they had already struck. She cried out and rushed after them, her heart pounding so loud she could not hear her own words, only the laughter of the men as they called him a thief, a savage, a curse upon the land. They shoved him to his knees in the dirt, the barrel of a rifle pressed against his back, and for a moment the world seemed to tilt, the air thick with dust and fear. Kael lifted his head, his dark eyes steady even as blood stained his cheek. His voice came low but clear, carrying over the silence that had fallen. "Let them take me," he said, each word careful through the weight of his accent. "Not your fight." His calm cut her deeper than the sight of the ropes on his wrists. She shook her head, tears blurring her vision, but he met her gaze again and repeated the words, his dignity unbroken, even as the men spat on him and called for a rope. Something inside Miriam snapped then, something long buried beneath years of silence and fear. She turned toward the cabin, her steps quick and sure, though her body trembled with every heartbeat. Against the wall still leaned her father's old rifle, worn smooth with age, but strong enough to speak when it mattered. She took it in her hands, the wood rough beneath her fingers, and stepped back into the yard. Her arms shook, her breath came in ragged bursts, but she raised the barrel and aimed it at the men. Her voice cracked, yet carried strong enough to still their movements. "Let him go." The laughter that followed was sharp and cruel, but when they saw her finger tighten against the trigger, their smiles faltered. One of them cursed and spat in the dust, another muttered that she had lost her mind, but still, she did not lower the gun. Her hands quivered so hard, she thought she might drop it, yet she held steady, her body a barrier between them and Kael. The silence stretched long, broken only by the restless snort of a horse and the faint rattle of the wind through dry grass. Finally, one of the men stepped back, muttering that she was not worth the trouble, and the others followed, mounting their horses with threats thrown over their shoulders. The sound of hooves faded into the distance, leaving only the heavy stillness of the yard. Miriam's arms sagged as she lowered the rifle, her knees weak beneath her. She rushed to Kael's side, her fingers fumbling against the knots until the rope gave way. He rose slowly, his body stiff with pain, and looked down at her with a gaze that held both sorrow and something deeper. His voice was hoarse but steady when he spoke. "You tied your life to mine now." She felt her chest tighten at the weight of those words, yet she did not flinch. She met his eyes, her breath shuddering, and whispered that she already knew. They left before dawn the next day, the sky still pale and cool, the sound of hooves far behind them, but never far enough from memory. Miriam rode with her heart hammering, every gust of wind carrying the echo of shouts, every shadow on the ridge a reminder of the men who would not forgive her choice. Kael guided them higher into the hills, his stride steady though his body still carried bruises from the beating. They moved in silence, the kind born not of fear but of knowing words would not change what had already been done. She had chosen him before the world, and now there was no turning back. By midday they reached a narrow pass where stone walls rose high and the sound of water trickled faintly in the distance. Kael led her into a hidden canyon where green ferns clung to the rocks and the air felt cooler, safe, as though the world outside could not enter. Miriam's breath eased as she stepped into the clearing and saw a small fire already burning, tended by an elder whose face was lined with the deep creases of time. His eyes lifted, sharp and knowing, and though his body was bent with age, his presence was strong. He looked at Kael first, then at her, and Miriam felt the weight of his gaze, as if he saw every truth she carried, every fear, every choice. Kael spoke in his own tongue, the words rolling low and steady, his hand brushing against his chest as he spoke of her. The elder listened, without interrupting, his eyes never leaving Miriam's face. At last he nodded, his voice deep as he replied, though she could not understand the meaning. Kael turned to her then, his expression softer than she had ever seen, and spoke slowly in broken English. He says heart speaks true, not law, not paper. You and me. Choice. Miriam felt her throat tighten, the world narrowing to the fire, crackling between them and the man who stood beside her. There was no church here, no priest, no ink on paper to bind them, yet the moment felt more sacred than any sermon she had ever heard. The elder reached into a pouch and drew out a strip of rawhide, placing it in Kael's hands. Kael took her fingers gently, his touch warm and sure, and bound their hands together with the leather. His voice was quiet but firm as he spoke in Apache, vows she did not understand but felt in the weight of each syllable. Then he looked into her eyes and whispered in English, "I stay, I fight, I carry with you." Her own voice trembled, but she found the words, simple as they were, "I will walk beside you, not behind, not apart, but with you." The elder gave a single nod, the firelight catching the lines of his face as though sealing the union himself. When the binding was finished, Kael did not kiss her, nor did she expect it. Instead, he pressed his forehead lightly to hers, their bound hands resting between them, and in that quiet she felt more married than any town could ever make her. She was his wife, not by law of men, but by the choice of two souls who had stood against the world and still found each other. The first winter in the canyon was hard, yet not without its quiet blessings. Snow lay heavy on the ridges, turning the world white and still, and Miriam learned to cut wood beside Kael. Her hands blistered, but her spirit steadied. At night the fire cracked warm against the stone walls, and Kael showed her how to dry strips of meat, how to lay herbs beneath their bed to keep sickness away, how to read the signs of the wind before storms arrived. She had lived her whole life on the edge of survival, but here she felt less like she was merely enduring, and more like she was building, each day carrying a weight of purpose she had not known before. When spring came, the stream swelled with meltwater, and Miriam planted seeds in the soft earth near its banks. Her hands dug deep into the soil, dirt pressed beneath her nails, yet with every sprout that pushed through she felt something inside her pushing free as well. She sang the old hymns her mother once taught her, the tunes rough on her tongue, yet sweet in memory. And Kael would pause in his hunting to listen, his head tilted as though he could hear the meaning, even if not the words. Sometimes he answered in his own tongue, a chant that rose and fell with the rhythm of the hills, and though neither could fully understand the other, the songs wove together like threads of one cloth. By summer, the cabin was surrounded by corn and beans, and Kael had built a drying rack for the fish he caught in the stream. Miriam no longer thought of herself as a woman abandoned by loss, but as one who had chosen a life with her own hands. She woke each morning to the sound of Kael sharpening his knife or stoking the fire, and the sight of him moving through the clearing no longer filled her with the edge of fear, but with a steady warmth. She knew he could be dangerous, that the strength in his arms could break what threatened them. Yet she also knew his gentleness. The way he brushed the hair from her face when she bent over her work, the way he bound her hand when she cut it on a thorn. Word of her choice still traveled beyond the hills. When she ventured into town for salt or needles, she felt the whispers pricking her skin like thorns, the sideways glances, the muttered words not meant for her ears. Yet she no longer flinched. She returned home each time with her back straight and her chin lifted, and when Kael took her hand beneath the shade of the cottonwood, the whispers lost their power. She was not stolen, not given, but found, and that truth settled deeper than any insult hurled by fearful tongues. As the seasons turned again, and autumn painted the canyon in gold, Miriam sat by the stream, watching the leaves drift like embers on the water. Kael knelt beside her, laying his bow across his knees, and when he reached for her hand, she met his gaze with a smile. They had carved a life apart from the noise of two worlds that had tried to deny them. A life not bound by law or fear, but by love chosen without shame. And in that choice, she had found herself whole at last. If this story left its mark on you, subscribe, like, and saddle up for more videos.